My name is John Anderson. I'm a member of the Norfolk Conservation Commission, and we're here at City Meadow in the center of Norfolk. This is a wetlands in the very center of town. We'll pan around here. You see there's a boardwalk. Got Route 44 across the way. The backside of buildings like Infinity Hall and the Arcadian building. And this was a site that had been filled with an invasive plant known as Phragmites, or the common reed. Very tall, clonally spreading grass. And for a number of years this was just mowed, and people thought of it as an eyesore. So several years ago, the idea came to several people in town who wanted to beautify the area and make it a little bit more user-friendly, I guess you would say, as a wetlands. Hence, we have a boardwalk so people can move through, closely observe this wetlands, and a lot of the Phragmites has been eliminated. And we'll talk about that as we proceed. So a couple years ago, they did a lot of work sculpting this land a little bit and preparing for the boardwalk and planting a number of native plants. So where we eliminated Phragmites or did not have Phragmites, a number of plants were either seeded in or planted as plugs, basically roots of herbaceous plants, and shrubs and trees planted as balls of plants where they were balled up and planted, typically as you get in any landscaping job. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of all that as we go along here as well. So this is the beginning. We're right behind the firehouse in Norfolk, right off of Shepherd Road. And this is the beginning, or one of the beginnings. The trail is another entrance off of 44, but this one has a little bit of parking right now, taken up by the state highway supplies for road maintenance. And so we have a little gravel walkway up to this nice boardwalk here. And as you can see, it's pretty lush vegetation right now, but I do want to point out there that despite that there are some native plants that are here that were here before and were planted. I'll go over some of the planted things. I believe some of the cattails were planted, though cattail was also native, so it's hard to know, which is which here. A Eupatorium called boneset is over here, common wet meadow or wetland plant. Oh, here's a closer one right here. But we also have a number of non-native plants growing here, and to the other side of here, this is like one of our more evil invasive plants. This is mugwort. Smells like sage. These leaves down here are a little bit more distinctive of that plant, and it'll produce a lot of little flowers and seeds later. And it smells like sage or sagebrush. It's clonal and it'll spread, and this can take over. We also have newly moved in here this plant over here. Back up here a little bit, and this is Canada Thistle. Again, a non-native invasive plant. You can see all the little seeds it's going to end up producing. Thorny, as many thistles are. So in disturbed sites, we get these non-native invasive plants very often getting established, and then they can take over, and that's how the Phragmites got started. So we want to eventually take care of these plants. So let's move through though and look at some of the nicer plants and what happened with the plantings here. So if we look off, this is to the west side of the path, on the right here. We have a nice cover of vegetation, and this was a lot of this was seeded in. We have, if you look closely, we have a sedge that's become established here from seeding in. Some of this may be native, but I believe all of this was probably from the seed that was distributed here. Again, the bone set, cattails, and then there's some shrubs in here too. You can see there's a shad bush. This is one of our earliest flowering native plants. This is a shrubby shad bush. That was planted in here. So there are some other shrubs around. We'll pass those later. The red maples here were planted, but you can see that they're actually not doing well. Again, these were balled and burlapped landscape trees put into a wetland, and just too wet for these plants, and they are slowly dying back. Not atypical of a wetland, so it was just kind of an expensive way to go about creating a sort of a dead and dying typical tree situation for a wetland. There is a tamarack over there that seems to have done well. That was also would have been planted. There's a willow back over, that shrubby willow. That probably was native and already there in that site. And you can hear birds, and there's some insects flitting around, and you can see this site is useful to wildlife and much more attractive, and you can see through this it's diverse, and so we are well on our way to a much nicer wetlands here than was here before. We'll keep on walking through here. Again, some of the planted things. This is a elderberry. This will produce eventually when it gets older. This is still young, not producing flowers yet. White umbrella-like cluster of flowers, and will produce dark berries, which are actually edible, but the wildlife really like them, so we'll save them for the wildlife. And we have this pond that was dug out. This is not natural at all. It's not really even natural to this kind of a site. This wet meadow would have tapered off if you look on the upper bank on the other side, and would have tapered down here, and this was a whole just sloping meadow. We have actually several of these in town, sort of a necklace of these little wetlands that occur along this whole kind of lower drainage through the center of town. But for a aesthetic purpose, it was decided to put this pond in, and we'll get a better view of that when we can go over to the newly installed platform over there, the deck. Do want to point out too that even though a lot of this looks natural, looks very attractive, again, there's a combination of things. The blue vervain is a probably seeded in, but very common wetland plant or wet meadow plant. And this is going to be an aster, or is an aster, and will flower. A swamp aster. But we also have this plant, which hopefully was not seeded in, but does come in. This is a purple loosestrife, and another invasive plant, can be really detrimental to wetlands, can dominate a wetland. This will need to be eliminated, otherwise we'll just have this as a dominant plant throughout the whole thing. Attractive in time, nectar plant for pollinators, but not a native plant and not a good plant for us to let get established in this wetland. So this purple loosestrife, there's a biological control for this, and it's a little beetle that has been released, and now so many have been released that they're spreading naturally through this area, and this is what they do. There's little holes all through these leaves, and when there's enough beetles, they basically defoliate the plant and will kill the plant back, or certainly knock it back so that it's a depauperate plant and not capable of dominating the site. So we are seeing that beetle even occurring here in Norfolk, even though it wasn't released at this site. We still have that beetle damage occurring on the purple loosestrife. And over here, where you can see these nice cattail heads, is a native cattail. And I'm going to break off a head of these. So now I've documented taking this head. And then I'll take one off the non-native one as well, which is this. So, this is our common native cattail, and this is a narrow-leaved cattail. And so you can see the difference in the size of the seed heads here. The native one is much fatter in terms of width to length as compared to the non-native narrow-leaved cattail. And the leaves are obviously quite different too, but this is the real diagnostic characteristic. And what you can see is in this flower structure, these are female flowers, or were a cluster of female flowers. These were clusters of male flowers. Male flowers are all died back, fluff off. These are producing seeds. And you can see that these male flowers came right down and touched the female flowers. They join right there. In the non-native, this was the male flower cluster, and then it stops. And you have this little bit of stem between the female flowers and the male flowers. And that's very diagnostic to this non-native cattail. So when we look out through this meadow, we are going to see mostly the native cattail, but we will also get patches of this non-native cattail. Again, it would be worthwhile to try to eliminate some of these non-native plants and try to encourage more of the native ones. All right, we will be walking now. Boardwalk goes into this little bit of a woodland, and we'll talk a little bit about that and the different plants that are growing in a woodland situation rather than this open meadow. So we'll move ahead. Okay, we're making a brief stop here, but we're on the Boardwalk, and we're at the location of the outlet water flow for this wetland. So Shepherd Road is to our north, and the stream is flowing that way. Will flow underground and under the road, and eventually it comes out by Meadowbrook. And looking the other direction, so we're looking south, and so you have a lot of cattail here. There's a bit of a swale, broadens out, really flattens out and disappears further up. But this was a natural outflow for this water before we even ever did any work here. I remember years ago coming through here, it was a meadow. There was always some cattails here. There was also fringe gentian and other plants growing nearby in this location. Because it was a little bit wetter, a little bit different from the rest of the meadow, which was grassy and flat. This area here was originally designed to be carry water flow and spread it out. The Conservation Commission did submit a letter with some concerns about how that would get done, and so there was a little modification. So going upstream here, we asked that it not be channelized so much, and so be allowed to spread out. So we get a little bit of that happening better than originally planned. And you can hear the water flowing here. So there is water, and a few things that we did in here to encourage sedimentation control was there's a core or a straw barrier that was laid here to slow the water flow, so you didn't get as much erosion. And you can see it's getting vegetated. This is going to rot in place. So this was a good idea to help while this was bare and under construction before they put some mat down to help control that erosion, put some seed down. But we knew that this was going to be, could still be a problem for a while. So they put these cores down to help control that flow, hold back some sedimentation, hold back the water flow a little bit so we didn't get so much erosion through here. All right, again, we're going to continue on to this little woodlands over here. All right, so we're in this little bit of a woodlands. This was here prior to any work being done. Not much was done in here. There's a little bit of, there was some plantings of shrubs in here, and it looks like from time to time some seed mix also got distributed in this kind of general area. But mostly this is the vegetation that was here before. So we have this little bit of woodlands here that was here prior to any of the construction that went on. Primarily what we have is Quaking Aspen and American elm. A few other plants, there's a little bit of red maple, there was some ash, a few oddball plants. There's a spruce tree here. There's a red cedar not doing well, but you know, a red cedar here. And mixed up with some willows, likely a pussy willow. Some other shrubs. There's a silky dogwood. These look like they're planted. This is the silky dogwood. This was one of the plants planted as a native plant in this site. So there's a series of these plantings here. There's also a non-native plant, the Glossy Buckthorn. That, oh, here it is right here. This is another awful invasive plant, non-native, an alternate leaf plant. Has these dark berries. They start off red, actually start off green, turn red, turn black, and related to the buckthorns, but one of the differences, it has this brownish, tannish bud that is actually pretty soft, not a hard, scaly bud. Because that's the way you can distinguish this, and has a very obvious leaf as well. Strong venation in this leaf, and shiny, glossy buckthorn. And then you can also, if we look, we see a lot of liatris growing in this, so we know that this was not much of a disturbed site. So this was a plant that was already coming in to this site. But you'll also think, if you can observe, a lot of bumblebees right now using these flowers, and so they do serve that purpose of producing nectar. The problem is when they dominate a site, you get nectar during that period of time when they're flowering, and then nothing, because they're dominating and they're not allowing that other sort of staggered flowering of other plants, because they've dominated and they've taken over where those other plants might be. That's why we want to get rid of that non-native plant. Again, looking through here, and many of these things were native plants. We've got some rushes or juncus growing here, a native wetland plant, and this fern. This is sensitive fern, and this can form patches, but this is a native plant. Tends not to completely take over. It gets mixed up with other things, but it can form fairly dense patches. But you can see how it's all mixed up. If you look down here, we can see how this is mixed up with the juncus and some other plants. And I just wanted to point out, this is the sort of fruiting body of the fern. So this is going to produce spores. All ferns are going to produce a spore in one of their life stages. And so this is a sterile leaf frond, and if you look at one of these fruiting or spore producing fronds, this is just a modification. These are just the same pinnules of the frond that have been modified because they're producing spores, and they become reduced and misshapen to hold spores. So these will dry and produce a fine dust, which is actually spores, which will produce eventually a salsa for the next generation of fronds. This actually I have observed in the winter. These will be these dark brown, almost blackish clusters on the stem, and turkeys will go along in the wintertime and they'll strip them. They'll actually put their beaks on them and they'll pull up on that, and they will apparently eat the spores, which would be high in protein. But it seems like they're basically eating dust. But that's a common occurrence to see in the wintertime, where turkeys have gone through and stripped these spore producing portions of the ferns. So now we're going back out as we're proceeding through here. We're going to continue out and go into back into this open wet meadow. We're going to actually cross over, go over to the pond, and then we circle around. Yeah, so here we are on the boardwalk in the more open area of the meadow. This is also partly where that swale comes through. So if we're looking north, this is where the water would be coming down as we get excess water from drainage off the roads, or just water in general coming off of here. It's going to concentrate here, run out this way. But you can see that this is really well vegetated, and this is what we were hoping for. Still a lot of purple loosestrife in here, but a lot of other plants, mostly native plants, so there are some non-native grasses in here as well. So let me point out a few of the things besides what we've already seen: loosestrife and cattails, the sedges growing fairly densely underneath this. We also have some larger flowering plants through here. We have this Joe pieweed, spotted Joe pieweed, growing here. This may have come in naturally, or it may have been part of the seed mix. It was part of the seed mix. The Eupatoriums are notorious for being poisonous to people and cattle, but does seem to be eaten by a few other things. There's certainly insect damage on some of these. These are great pollinator plants that have tiny flowers, but they'll end up producing a lot of nectar, and much like on a goldenrod later in the season, you'll see lots of butterflies and pollinators on these plants. This again, we saw once early on, this is blue vervain, and this is again a common wetland plant. Tiny blue flowers on this, but fairly large, tall plant, which can look really attractive when it's in flower. And as we look down there, you can see some of these going past now, but you can see the taller plant out there is actually all this blue vervain. And then we have, again, some of the Joe pie weeds, a little bit lower, not as robust out there as this plant is right here. Another plant, again, native, may or may not have been part of the seed mix, was here before all this, and this is the spotted touch-me-not. Spotted because there's little spots on the flowers. Jewelweed, sometimes called, an annual and very common in our wetlands, native plant around here. has an interesting characteristic when after these flowers end up producing seed. If you touch them, the seed pods, they explode and throw their seed out. So there's a little kind of little interesting character of propelling its seeds as far away as it can, just by touching it, which is also why it's called touch me not, because that's what I'll do. I'll throw my seed if you touch me. Again, we're going to point out that this whole area was dominated by Phragmites, a grass, and here it is close up. So this had been all Phragmites, and you see it was fairly successfully controlled. It's still here, still needs more control. But this is a grass, coarse grass, can grow 12 feet tall. And you know, we see it very commonly in our wetlands around here, and it has a fluffy flower head eventually. But this is what it's going to look like. It's kind of alternating stiff, broad leaves, clonally spreading, as many grasses are, and forming dense colonies, and very often very little growing with it. And changing the whole structure. This meadow here, the plants are fairly low. In the Phragmites you're talking about now, this reed structure, the vegetation, which may be suitable for some animals, certain birds, but not to many others, and certainly would not be important to our pollinators, because you would get very few of these flowering plants. And very few flowers, even of those plants, because of the shading caused by these tall grasses. So we're in the swale, so looking south, and you can see how this all just kind of slopes away, but was originally fairly level. So the water would come from drainage, further up slope there, but also all along this edge. This is a good place to see it, but all along this edge, this is all fill, but there's seeps all through it. So originally this hillside, the water just kind of started to come out near about where that fill is. The water was just kind of weeping out in places, and otherwise be also in the groundwater. And this doesn't take much to dig down and find water anywhere through here, and that was always the case. So this was always this kind of wet, soppy area. And if trees were in it, it'd be a swamp. And if it was kept open, either because of a little excess water in here, or because it was managed, or it might have even burned on occasion. Or the trees would grow up, fall down, and it'd become a meadow. And then they would grow up eventually, be a forest, fall down, become a meadow. So this would have been the kind of the structure here. There were other trees out here, and you can see some old snags left. And as we go up above, we'll look down, and you'll see some dead trees laying there. So it could support forest, and it did support, more tree growth. But as far as this landscape project went, the idea was to create this lower wet meadow type vegetation, some shrubs, mostly herbaceous, that you could look over top of, have a lot of flowering plants, and look more attractive to people, encourage them to come down to this site and get close to nature. All right, we're going to move on to the new deck that overlooks the pond. A little farther away, but from where we just started. But here's a different kind of site here, and you can see the changes in vegetation. Not so much the change in elevation, but the change in vegetation here. And this taller grass over here, which is actually occurring close up here too, but it's dense right there, is rice cut grass, a native plant. Generally comes into newly open, disturbed wetlands, and can dominate like it is over here in this patch. Eventually, it becomes a plant that is just incorporated and occurs in little patches where it can get established and less competition from other plants. It will lose out to competition from other plants. But right now, it's dominating here, and it's called cut grass because actually, if you walk through it or you move your arm through it, there's little hairs and spikes really off of the leaf edges, little teeth sort of that are bristles. And if you move through that, there's so many of them that it can actually scrape your hand or your arm as you move through it. So it'll cut you. So therefore, cut grass. But again, a native plant, desirable plant, and it will always be part of the composition here and dominate only patches as it can. Usually, like open mud flats, once the water level changes and drops, this grass can come in and dominate for a few years. That's enough of that. Again, looking out into the meadow right here, we have another native plant, Fireweed, which again would come in a newly disturbed site. So it's very common in this particular area right now. But you can see how all these brown stems through here. This is all mostly the Phragmites, the common reed, all through here that was killed off, and so that left bare soil. What came back is predominantly this site, Fireweed. We had cut grass coming back in the other site. Here we've got Fireweed coming back in to dominate this site. Other plants are going to come in and take over through here. We've got even some ferns down in there. There'll be others. This will also make it, as they finish controlling the Phragmites, the intent is to seed this again wherever they've killed off the vegetation, seed it in again to native plants. So you'll get both again, whatever native plants survive and whatever comes brought in the seed mix. So this was an area, this is kind of in the middle of the thick of it here, and so this was an area heavy in Phragmites, and now we have something which is quite different, and maybe doesn't look terribly attractive right now, but ultimately this will regenerate into mostly native vegetation, but will require some work. It'll require diligence in terms of removing Phragmites, diligence in removing other non-native invasives like purple loosestrife, and in order to not have taller shrubs and trees growing here, we'll probably end up mowing this at least periodically in order to keep down that vegetation, and also to maintain some of the lower growing flowering plants and native plants that would occur that would benefit from a mowing regime in this area. So here we are on the deck that overlooks the pond that was again newly constructed as part of this landscape project. Again, not a natural part of this, and the stones were also placed here. This again is not a natural aspect to this site, as this site would have been deep soils, pretty much continuous rock free, and holding a lot of moisture, and therefore allowing this kind of meadow to get established and persist in a site like this. So we do have some things that were planted here very nicely in plugs, and therefore they got established very quickly, and you can see how well vegetated the banks of this pond are. Close up in patches, we have a tall bulrush, native plant as well, and very attractive and large, blends well with this cattails along the margins. You can see in some of these low areas, down over here, we've got Arrowhead, a wetland plant, often likes its feet very, very wet, which is why it's in this little spot right here, and also growing out into the deeper water as an emergent plant. And you can see even some of the bulrush and the cattails are also growing out, not as thickly as it moves out. Unfortunately, we get a lot of algae growth through the pond right now, and the vegetation probably needs to develop more in this area, so that it would still be algae, you just wouldn't see it because you would have denser vegetation, emergent vegetation growing up through here. And in which case, I think when you eventually have the various pond lilies and other deeper emergence growing here, this pond will look more attractive over time. Those will all end up dying back, the water will clear in the wintertime, and it will be, again, appear to be open water at that point. Again, this is all stages of development in this landscape project. And you can see, as we look out around it, going back to the uplands, here the site is again dominated by cattail. Again, cattail is a very attractive plant, it's a native plant, but it can dominate and perhaps is not going to encourage a lot of the other flowering plants that we'd like to see here. Even though it's native, it's also a plant we probably want to think about possibly controlling in order to encourage the other wet meadow species that we'd like to see. So here we got a little plant called stone ditch. And just as you look really closely, I suspect this was just came in here naturally, or maybe it was always here. Little tiny flowering plant. If you look closely, it's very attractive close up. Small plant, just growing underneath with all this, cattail and cut grass. I wanted to just point this out because this is the only spot I've seen this particular plant. I'm sure it's occurring in other spots, but you can also get down close and look and see things that are unusual or attractive throughout this wetland, just from this boardwalk as well. So again, that's stone ditch, and if we look closely, I don't know how close you can get that, but if we look closely, you can see there's in this case, there's really no petals that you can see. So what you're really seeing in this plant are the anthers, the male parts of the plant, and in the center of this little crown where the ovaries are, and the female part of the flower is. But it makes for a nice little attractive plant, especially when you're looking down on it. Okay, so further upslope, we're getting to the edge of the wet meadow, though this is still part of the wet meadow. Right up, you can see this horsetail, a native horsetail growing here. You can see the Phragmites had been growing here. So this is still part of that whole wet meadow, even though we're quite a ways uphill and at the foot of this fill that is part of John Curtis Road. Another plant that's growing here is this plant. This is Sonchus. Not a native plant. Interesting plant. It's got attractive, yellow flowers, but has this kind of very bristly thistle-like leaf on it. But it's not a thistle. It's called Sonchus, and that is in spots. It occurs throughout this wetland, and this spot here it's very, very common through here. Possibly because it's a little bit drier than the rest of it, and probably in this disturbance of putting in this boardwalk, you ended up getting a a lot of these plants having a place to get established in this muddy area that would have been disturbed by, first, killing off some of the Phragmites, and secondly, by the equipment that compacted or helped bear the soil through here. So we can see Sonchus, especially on this near upland area, is very common up here. As native plants come in and dominate again, then this plant will tend to die off. This is a plant that often comes in newly disturbed areas, but doesn't like a lot of competition. So if this thickens up with a lot of other plants, some of our native asters and goldenrods, this plant will slowly diminish. Probably never go away completely, but it'll diminish as long as you have less disturbance. Okay, we're sort of at the top of the boardwalk now, at the near the top of this whole drainage area. And so as we're looking north. This is again part of that little bit of swale, a little bit over to our left here. And the rest of this whole broad, wet meadow plain that slopes downhill to that initial drainage area we started at. So here we can see again, the same composite usually of plants. We've got the fireweed, we still got some Sonchus, we've got some cattails, there's a variety of grasses in here. We've got different sedges and rushes growing in here. Also more commonly up here we're seeing this swamp aster. And we also, if you can see the blue tags out here, these are shrubs that were planted out here. Again, these were container plants put in here. They weren't grown in the wetlands. They're native plants that were put into this wetland area. And for the most part, they're not doing well in the wetter parts of this meadow. We've got a variety of things. We've got Aronia, which is a chokeberry, and we've got Clethra, which is not native to Norfolk, but is a Connecticut, New England native plant. Has nice, attractive white flowers in the summertime. So it's often used in landscaping as a native plant because it flowers in the summertime rather than a strict spring flowering plant, as so many of our shrubs are. There is also Bayberry planted here, and so if we look now to the south and looking upslope from here, we still see all these blue tags on the various shrubs that were marking where those shrubs were, so they could determine which ones died, how many survived, in not total number but in percentage. So unfortunately, these shrubs, many of them did not survive, as was the case with the trees that were planted here as well. So as we move further to the upland, these shrubs will do better, and as we move into the wetter areas, they're going to do poorly, even though many of them are wetland plants, but because they were grown as nursery stock, their feet are just really too wet. Some will persist and struggle along, and maybe eventually, many years from now, they'll become attractive plants. Oh, there is one shrub here too I want to point out because I see it. And this is what we call shrubby cinquefoil. This was also planted here, a native plant in these kind of wet meadows. We would see this a very usually low-growing shrub. People planted ornamentally in their homes. Related to the potentillas, the cinquefoil, kind of the herbaceous cinquefoils we see in lawns or edges of places, rough areas, old fields, things like that. So it has the same kind of flower, but this is a shrub. And it can get a few feet tall, so, but it usually has a nice mounding form to it. So this will be a plant which seems to be one of the ones that have survived best of the whole suite of shrubs that they planted here. So if you are seeing these blue tags, that's what they're marking. They're marking the plants that were inventoried after a year after the planting of these to determine which ones were survived and which ones didn't. We're going to walk a little bit farther, so you can see now this large tree here. This is a cottonwood. These trees might, spring up at times and would be. This is a very fast-growing tree. And as you see, that there are trees like this throughout, red maples and elms, cottonwood, quaking aspen. There's an ash as well, and these are going to be part of this wet meadow as well, and will can grow up and create a forest, or maybe an open forest, or a wetlands, a swampy area at some point if we don't control it. We could let it go that way, and that would be natural for those things to kind of develop, die back, become more meadow, more forest, less forest over, decades. But the getting back to the trees, so this is the cottonwood, called cottonwood because it produces these fine little seeds on little cottony tufts, and so they drift around, and sometimes like snow in the springtime when they go to seed, and have this cottony debris from their seed dispersal mechanism. We'll move up to the swale, the rest of the swale and channel, and this is taking drainage from road drainage, and you can see the stones up there where there's an outlet for the culvert that's collected the water in various places. And so there was always a channel in here. It was fairly well established, but the disturbance in bringing in equipment and everything actually created a greater erosion problem than we had before. Again, there were these straw cores put down, and other kind of water barriers and stones to be placed, still need to be placed in some of these areas to help control the erosion. But you can see even here how the soil has subsided. That this was a flat meadow area here, but with the erosion, these have dropped down. You can see whole sections of soil, like right down here, whole sections have dropped down. This still needs to stabilize. The vegetation will stabilize a lot of this, but they may also still need to put some stones in. Actually, I don't know if you can zoom in there, but you can see where the water is coming from. But this is not just water coming out of this drainage, but there's water that's seeping right out of the ground over there, coming laterally this way into this ditch, because this whole area is wet. It's not just storm drainage that's making this wet. This whole area is just this basin in the middle of town, and the water is just, in this case, we can see the water seeping out of the banks and filling this channel, and then looking downstream, and you can see stronger water flow has actually knocked down some of these cattails. So when we had like thunderstorms coming through last week, then this is what it would do. It would knock down some of this vegetation, and that, of course, always is helping. The vegetation is helping to slow that water flow, control some of the erosion. So the fact that we have a good cover of vegetation through here is helping us keep this area, the water clean, the site stable. Again, we've got cattails here. We've got the touch-me-not or jewelweed. Really very lush through here, as well as a variety of grasses and scirpuses, rush. Some of this from seeds, some of this naturally occurring. We're circling around, heading back. We're at the end of the boardwalk section of this section of the boardwalk, going to a gravel path. I wanted to point out there's this beautiful yellow flower. It's a Rudbeckia, which is related to our black-eyed Susan, but this is orange coneflower. It's a native eastern U.S. Plant, but not native to Norfolk. I don't believe it's even native to Connecticut, but it would naturalize, and it's been planted here in Connecticut. Very attractive looking, plant. You see that kind of, besides the dark eye, black eye of it, you've got this brownish, reddish coloration near the center of the flower, and then becoming bright yellow on the outside. So an attractive plant will require a certain amount of mowing, periodic mowing if you want, and what that means is like once a year mow this area back so it doesn't grow up too much to other things, to allow this plant to persist here. And so I want to point out, like the Quaking Aspen and the Cottonwood. This, I believe, looks more like a cottonwood, but and here would be, this is the Quaking Aspen, and so this is a sprout. There's a larger one here, over here, and then there's a sprout, which is probably from the roots of this plant here, more than likely. And the reason it's called Quaking Aspen is that you have these leaves in the Quaking Aspen, fine teeth in this triangular or roundish leaf, and the petiole, which is the portion that the stem of the leaf, is flattened. So you couldn't roll it, as in many leaf petioles would be round. This is flattened, so you see it's thinner there and wider there, and that's what gives the Quaking Aspen its quaking. So you'll see this plant, and if we look up, you can see that one. You can see in the even light breezes, the leaves move very easily. I can't tell you what the ecological significance of that is. We know some of the reasons for plant morphology and their ecological significance. This one I don't know why the plant does that. Perhaps it makes it so that the leaf is less likely to be torn off in wind because it can be a little bit more flexible, at least in one direction. But that's speculation on my part. But those were already here, and as you can see, there's a group of them all root suckering now, and these will continue to grow into small trees. They're usually not long-lived, but they still live decades, just not hundreds of years. And so they could still end up blocking the view here, or also providing shade for a section of this boardwalk. So determination will have to be made is how much you want to control this, and also it's certainly going to be important not to let these things continue out into the wet meadow and become a forest rather than a meadow. So again, as we look and we observe these plants, there's also these management considerations that we have to think about as well. And so, like I said, we're really at the end of our trip here. We're going to follow this little gravel area back down to the boardwalk, and then back to the beginning. And so thank you for joining me on this walk through City Meadow. Again, this is brought to you by the Norfolk Conservation Commission. I want to thank John DeShazo for filming this for us today. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do this live, and so I appreciate having the opportunity to be able to do this for you today. And so everybody stay safe and come out and take a walk. If you can, view this video before or during your visit here, but certainly come out. And it's easy to keep social distancing in this area, but it's a beautiful spot, and it's a developing spot. It has a lot of stories and information that you can learn and take home with you that I think will be worthwhile. So again, thank you very much. There we go.